step back from our usual focus on Israel and take a wider look at what is happening in the Middle East and how Israel's relations with its neighbors are progressing or regressing, as the case may be. So, welcome to our neighborhood, the Middle East. And we start with the big questions that everybody's asking. Will the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip claim and calm the tension between Egypt and Israel? Will the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt hold? There are also growing concerns in the Eastern Mediterranean as Turkey is flexing its muscles, making threats against Israel and also pressuring Greece and Egypt on various issues. Turkey is also interested in sending troops to a multinational force to try and govern the Gaza Strip after Hamas is removed. But for Israel, this is completely unacceptable to have Turkish forces on the ground. And further afield, in Yemen, the condition of the Houthi defense minister, who was wounded in earlier Israeli strikes on the organization in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, is rapidly deteriorating. And Israel's Air Force has said that more strikes on the Houthis might be necessary, and a senior Houthi officer has defected to the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Finally, there is movement towards a renewal of negotiations on the nuclear issue with Iran, and there are also signs that we're moving towards more kinetic battles with the Islamic Republic. At this point, we're at a crossroads, and it's difficult to predict which way the things will go. So welcome to Boots on the Ground. I'm your host, Yair Pinto, and today we're continuing to bring you all the truth about what's happening in Israel, but also the wider Middle East and its implications on the Jewish state. So, the main question that we're looking to solve today is, will the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip calm the tensions between Egypt and Israel? What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments. So Prime Minister Netanyahu's meeting with the Egyptian intelligence, the chief Hassan Rashad in Jerusalem this week signals a certain thaw in Cairo, meaning Jerusalem's relations after months of tensions around the Rafah border crossing and the Philadelphia corridor. So security officials say that this is a positive signal, but not a real breakthrough. In Egypt, they warned that any idea of return to fighting in the Gaza Strip or violation of the understandings could collapse this very fragile agreement. On the other hand, without the issue of Gaza, Egypt's regional and international relevance is fading, and this could have devastating consequences for Egypt's already very fragile economy. But there is another regional power which would like to get involved in what's happening in the Gaza Strip, and that's Turkey. So Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear this week in meetings with visiting US Vice President J.D. Vance that Turkish troops that are being sent to the Gaza Strip as part of an international force would be a red line. Vance reportedly assured Netanyahu that America understands this and agrees that it would not be appropriate for Turkey to join this effort at this time. It is important to remember that Turkey already has large forces deployed in northern Syria, and they're separated from the IDF forces that are deployed in the buffer zone in the southern parts of Damascus by a relatively narrow strip of land which is under the loose control of forces loyal to the al-Julani regime. There are many ways that things could go very bad in Syria, in ways that would quickly escalate into a situation where Israeli and Turkish troops would be dangerously close to each other. This is another reason that Israel would not want Turkish troops in Gaza in order to avoid the possibility of facing Turkish troops on two fronts in the event of an escalation from the north and from the Gaza Strip. With that in mind, there were clashes between forces loyal to the al-Julani regime and French jihadists in Syria this week after the regime launched a large operation in a refugee camp near the Turkish border where members of the French jihadist organization reside. According to reports, there were violent clashes which resulted in casualties on both sides. The jihadists claim that al-Julani wants to eliminate migrants, while the regime declared that their goal is to capture the head of the organization, Omar Omsen, and put an end to his influence in the camp. So far, this situation is fairly localized, but that could change very quickly. And meanwhile, in Jordan, Israel's neighbor to the east, the government has a habit of speaking harshly against Israel, but also maintains the peace treaty. This could change if Israel moves ahead with the annexation of Judea and Samaria, and we'll take a closer look at that scenario. And to Israel's south, developments in Yemen have the IDF deeply concerned. The conditions of the Houthi defense minister, who was wounded in a strike on a senior leadership in Sana'a 2 months ago, is rapidly deteriorating. So the Houthis have been publishing statements in his name since the strike, but he has not been seen in public, and now we know why. After he was absent from the funeral of the eliminated chief of staff, a Yemeni news portal, which is opposed to the terrorist organization, the Houthis, in Yemen, reported that his condition is deteriorating, saying that there has been no movement of his or communication with him. No communication has been identified. But that's not the only problem that the Houthis have this week. We'll also tell you about the senior Houthi officer who announced defection to the government forces of El Salahi, one of the Houthis' commanders in the city of Taiz, also called on all the Houthi members to return to the bosom of the homeland and the Republic. Leave the fighting and do not involve yourselves in the crimes of this militia, which is throwing the sons of Yemen into the fire. And finally, in Iran, 4 months after the Operation Rising Lion, they are rebuilding the nuclear facilities that were destroyed. And recently, the JCPOA nuclear agreement expired, and soon the Ayatollah regime will have to decide whether it is headed to a nuclear breakout, to negotiations, or to another round of fighting, another war. I'm Yair Pinto, and this is your Boots on the Ground report, containing all the truth about what's happening in Israel. And today, in this special edition, we will also bring you all the truth about what's happening in our neighborhood, the Middle East. A moment before we start, I want to call on you to continue in spreading the truth. We will continue to report about everything that's happening in Israel, boots on the ground style, and we will bring you the most up-to-date information about what is happening in the Middle East, but we need your help. So we'll be very glad if you hit that like button, leave a comment, and the most important thing that you do is hit that subscribe button. That tells the algorithm of YouTube that more people need to watch this content. Now let's start with what is happening on the southern border of the State of Israel with Egypt. Netanyahu's meeting with the Egyptian intelligence chief, Hassan Rashad, this week signals a certain thaw in the Cairo-Jerusalem relations after months of tension around Rafah and the Philadelphia corridor. But officials in both countries warned that this situation is actually very fragile and everything depends on the ceasefire in Gaza being maintained. However, the fact that Egypt's President El-Sisi sent his intelligence chief to Israel also emphasizes that Egypt sees itself as a central player in this region and a mediator and influential over a new regional agreement that President Trump is trying to establish in this region. And senior security officials say that for Egypt, the continuation of tension or calm in Israel-Egypt relations depends on Israel's conduct in the near term and the degree of implementation of the ceasefire agreement inside the Gaza Strip. Egypt claims that the main reason for the escalation was Israel's policy towards the Palestinians. And this is a change of direction that may help calm the relations. Tensions between the two countries reached a peak after Israel, during the war, took control of the Philadelphia corridor and the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing, while Egypt refused to recognize Israeli control of this place. And beyond that, in recent months, Egypt has conducted extensive diplomatic activity against Israel as the fighting in the Gaza Strip intensified and was a major supporter of moves by several Western countries to recognize a Palestinian state. In this context, we must also remember that Egypt saw President Trump's plan for large numbers of Gazan residents to move into Egypt as a threat to its nationality and its national security, and an element that exacerbates relations between it and between Israel. Now that this issue has been taken off the table within the President Trump's peace plan, this has helped reduce the tensions between Israel and Egypt. Political sources add that Egypt conditions the continued warming up of relations with Israel and Israel standing by its commitments to a full ceasefire and not returning to the cycle of fighting, and committing to open the Rafah crossing on a permanent basis. To back up for just a moment and review some history, relations between Israel and Egypt are based on the Camp David Accords brokered by the United States President Jimmy Carter in 1979, and over the years they have been characterized by relative diplomatic quiet and mutual economic and security interests, and not necessarily by real friendships. The meeting this week therefore constitutes a positive milestone and a declaration of willingness to cooperate, but it still does not change the basic picture in relations between the two countries. Trust between them is still very limited since the outbreak of this war, and even economic and security interests do not always overlap, and it is still unclear where things are headed. Much depends on the degree of success of the implementation of the President Trump's peace plan between Gaza and Israel. But between diplomacy and what is happening on the ground, there is a gap. For instance, smuggling of goods from Egypt into Gaza, including weapons and ammunition, in a major revenue stream of Egypt's deeply improvised economy, senior Egyptian military officials and regime officials are involved in this smuggling, and if it is completely shut off, this could have a destabilizing effect in Egyptian politics, which would not be a good news for Israel. Now that most of the smuggling tunnels running under the border have been shut down, the IDF is facing a drone train carrying goods that are being smuggled from Egypt into Gaza. These goods include everything that you can imagine, from cigarettes and narcotics to machine guns, rifles, and ammunitions. In the IDF, they call the current route the Big H, in which the equipment is transferred in the Nitzana, Ezuz, Har Harif area, and from there it is transferred by Israeli Bedouins from the southern parts of the country to the Kerem Shalom area, and the goods are transferred by drones into the Gaza area. In the IDF, they understand that this is no longer a negligible, limited route, but rather exceptionally large volumes of smuggling of goods and weapons between the two borders, Egypt, Israel, and then into Gaza. So the IDF is taking this problem very seriously and recently decided to introduce detection systems alongside electronic warfare systems to disrupt and to bring down the drones while being in the air. So as you can see, Egypt and Israel are drawing closer but cautiously. Both strive to establish diplomatic relations, conditional on continued calm and the opening of the Rafah border crossing. Egypt is also considering appointing an ambassador in Tel Aviv and integrating the move into the American initiative for a political arrangement. In Cairo, they emphasize that Hamas constitutes a direct threat, and some economic objections with Israel were temporarily frozen, but may be renewed if the stability is maintained for some time now. And for that matter, a lot depends on maintaining stability in Israel, and that also includes the Israeli economy, which has taken a lot of punishment in the last 2 years of war. As we move into the recovery phase, there are many opportunities to invest in Israel. So what if I told you that it's possible to invest in Israel's future while staying right on track with your own? Let me introduce you to Wise Money Israel, a team of American and Israeli financial professionals that I've personally known and trusted for years. Their CEO and his family are longtime friends of Mati Shoshani, and I trust them completely. This isn't about high-risk ventures or complicated investment. This is a practical, biblical way to stand with Israel by investing in Israeli stocks and in bonds, just like you do in the United States. In fact, it works just like your US-based brokerage or financial advisor. You're not on your own. Just give them a call and they'll walk you through everything step by step. Clients from over 30 countries work with Wise Money Israel because they deliver the same professionalism, integrity, and personalized service that you'd expect from any United States firm, with the added purpose of blessing Israel through our finances. So, if you're already investing and you're even thought, how can I put some of this to work for Israel? This is your opportunity. You can go to wisemoneyisrael.com/TBN. Again, that's wisemoneyisrael.com/TBN and schedule your free consultation today. This is your way to invest in Israel and support the Jewish state while making money. The contracts between Israel and Syria around a security agreement have reached a dead end following Israel's demand to open a humanitarian corridor to Suwaida province in the southern parts of the country. This is according to a recent Reuters report which cited sources familiar with the details of the talks. And in recent months, Israel and Syria conducted talks and recently even came close to an agreement on its general lines. The purpose of the agreement is to create a demilitarized zone that includes within it Suwaida province, where fighting broke out between Bedouin tribes and the Druze community during the month of July. According to the sources, Israel asked at an early stage of the talks to open a passage for transferring aid to Suwaida, but Syria rejected this on the grounds that it would harm its sovereignty. Israel repeated the demand at a later stage in this negotiation, according to two Israeli sources, a source in Syria and a source in Washington that are familiar with the details that was discussed. And according to the United States envoy Tom Barak, who mediated between the two countries within the framework of the agreement, Israel will stop its strikes in Syria, and interim President Abu Muhammad al-Julani's regime will commit not to move military equipment near the border with Israel. According to a diplomat familiar with the talks, instead of a security agreement between the countries, the United States is likely now aiming for an agreement that will prevent escalation. On that note, after the outbreak of fighting in southern Syria in July, Israel said it would act to protect the Druze population in the country and struck targets of this regime in Damascus, while Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel would not allow the regime to send its forces south of Damascus. Netanyahu also addressed this issue during his speech at the United Nations General Assembly in early September, saying that he believes there can be an agreement that respects Syria's sovereignty and protects minorities, including the Druze community. During his own United Nations General Assembly, al-Julani said that his country is committed to a dialogue despite Israeli strikes against it. He added, however, that Israeli policy is contrary to the international stance that supports Syria. This policy threatens to create new crises and struggles in a region. He added that for this purpose, and in light of this aggression, we are committed to dialogue, and we are committed to the 1974 disengagement arrangement. We call on all the international community to stand by us in light of this aggression, according to the Syrian president, al-Julani, who, by the way, was a former member of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization. I have to take a brief comment here, because it's deeply ironic that this former jihadist would talk like this. I think that the international community that he's applying to for support needs to very closely monitor him instead. And a recent investigation was published, including numerous testimonies and videos documenting numerous atrocities that were carried out by the regime forces and their allies against Druze civilians in Syria. In addition to murder, severe cases of humiliation were documented, such as shaving the mustaches of Druze men, which is a deep symbolic meaning for this community, and this is a shameful act. These acts, sometimes documented by the fighters themselves and also published on social media networks, spread fear amongst minorities throughout Syria. 10 months after the rebels toppled the Assad-based regime in Syria, the unrestrained bloodshed left many Syrians without hope that the long years of brutality had ended, but we don't know what's happening now because When al-Julani came to power last year, after his forces deposed of the Assad regime, which had ruled Syria with an iron fist for generations, he promised far-reaching reforms and protection of Syria's religious minorities, including Christians, Druze, and Alawites, as well as the establishment of peace after more than a decade of civil war. He also distanced himself from his previous ties to al-Qaeda and pledged to control the extremists in his coalition. This helped him with the winning of the support of the United States, of Europe, of the Gulf states, which granted his government economic aid and sanction reliefs. But these promises failed to materialize. And according to the investigation, already in March, government forces and their supporters massacred hundreds of civilians from the Alawite sect, the clan of the Assad family, in an obvious case of violent revenge. But this was just a warm-up to the even deadlier rampage a few months later in the Suwaida province, the Druze stronghold. What began as a conflict between rival militias quickly escalated into a mass slaughter as thousands of government soldiers were poured into that area, ostensibly to quell the fighting, but in practice, they joined the massacre of the civilians. And according to the independent monitoring source, around 2,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them civilians from the Druze sect, lost their lives in these events. And following the massacre, the supreme spiritual leader of the Druze community, Sheikh Hikam el-Khiraji, called for Suwaida's secession from Syria, and Druze militias effectively blocked the entry of government and army forces into most of the province. Similar concerns also arose amongst the Kurds in the northeastern part of the country, who delayed negotiations for their integration into the new government. And Israel, for its part, intervened and carried out airstrikes against Syrian government forces in order to protect the Druze community. These actions were seen as part of Israel's efforts to cultivate allies amongst the Druze and prevent Islamist extremists from entrenching themselves in southern Syria. The developments in Suwaida also highlighted the failure of the new Syrian government to stabilize the state and protect its minorities, and indicate a continued pattern of unrestrained sectarian violence, which is in complete contradiction to the promises of peace and protection of minorities that was made with the fall of the Assad regime. So, as Israel watches all of this drama unfolding on our northern border, we have no choice but to remain vigilant and protect the border and the buffer area so that our own communities in the Galilee will not be threatened with a spillover of this violence or something even worse. And here at TBN Israel, we will continue to report about everything that's happening on the ground. And the most important thing that you can do if you want to help us is to subscribe to TBN Israel YouTube channel, share these videos with anybody who wants to know the truth, and keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem. And now we are switching our focus to the situation in Yemen, which Israel is monitoring, as the Houthi rebel group has still not said that it will stop firing ballistic missiles and drones at Israel. However, almost 2 months after the IDF struck a gathering of senior Houthis who convened in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a, eliminating the prime minister and several other ministers, the Yemeni site Defense Line, which opposes the terrorist organizations, the Houthis, reported this week that Defense Minister Muhammad Nasser al-Atfi is rapidly deteriorating in his health conditions following the strike. The report cited sources with direct knowledge of his medical condition, as El-Tafi has been hospitalized since August 28, the day of the strike. Security sources told the Yemeni site that since the strikes, no communications or movements of El-Fati has been detected, and he was even absent on Monday from the funeral of Houthi Chief of Staff Muhammad Abdel El-Karim El-Gamari. The report also noted that the Houthi Interior Minister Abdel El-Karim al-Houthi is injured and, according to reports, has not been seen publicly for months. Similar to how they behaved before announcing the elimination of their chief of staff, the Houthis have in recent weeks continued to publish messages purportedly on behalf of the defensive minister, including recently a condolences message on the death of El Gamari. I don't know who they are trying to fool with these messages, but here in Israel, I don't think that anyone is very impressed. And there are indications that elsewhere in this region, no one else is impressed either. For instance, the Saudi-owned Al Arabiya network published a report this week that El Gamari was killed in a strike on August 28. Conversely, a Yemeni security source said that he was wounded in another strike and later he died of his wounds, which did not prevent the Houthis from continuing to issue written statements attributed to him personally until the announcement of his death. But the Houthis have other problems this week, and that includes a report that Colonel Salah el-Salahi, one of the Houthi commanders in the Taiz area of Yemen, disappeared from the front lines a few days ago. Then, on Tuesday, he surfaced at a meeting of government forces opposed to the Houthis in the city of Marib. In a statement he issued at this meeting, el-Salahi called on all the Houthi members to return to the embrace of the homeland and the Republic, leave the fighting, and not involve themselves in the crimes of the militia, which throws the people of Yemen into the fire. According to him, the Houthis commit the most heinous of crimes against their families and regions. They try to entrap future generations and spread their poisonous ideas. At the same time, a spokesman for the Yemeni army announced that the doors of the Yemeni government are open to anyone who will return to the straight path seriously, leave the Houthi terrorist militias, and refuse criminal acts and violations against the Yemeni people. On Wednesday, forces opposed to the Houthis in Yemen and supported by the United Arab Emirates announced that they seized an Iranian ship carrying weapons near Bab el-Mandab in the Red Sea that was on its way to the Houthis. A security source confirmed to Yemeni media reports that the seizure of the Iranian ship was carried out after close monitoring and tracking of its movements when it attempted to enter the Saudi territorial water. The ship, which originally departed from the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas, was seized and subjected to a thorough search, and 8 sailors identified with a Houthi leader were arrested as part of the smuggling network. The source also emphasized that this operation is part of a series of ongoing security successes achieved by the joint operation as part of the intensive efforts to fight smuggling and pursue Iranian support networks for the Houthi militias. And here, at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on all the truth of what's happening in Israel, and once again, we invite you to be part of the team by sharing our videos on YouTube, following us on social media, and by clicking the subscribe button if you haven't already. And now, let's conclude this special edition of Boots on the Ground by shifting our focus to the ongoing threat from Iran. Last weekend, quietly and without ceremony, the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear agreement with Iran expired. It never really lived up to its expectations and the expectations that their supporters had for it, except possibly for those members of the government that orchestrated this idea and this deal. Be that as it may, 4 months after the 12-day war with Iran, which saw the Islamic Republic humiliated as it lost many of its strategic assets without being able to do very much damage to Israel, the Ayatollah regime is now rebuilding the nuclear facilities that were destroyed. So, it is true that President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement 7 years ago, but until last Saturday, at least formally, Iran's nuclear program was under the agreement's constraints. From now on, the Iranians claim there are no limits on the nuclear program. They're also saying that there are no longer constraints by the JCPOA agreement, which expired last Wednesday. But once again, I don't think that anyone really believes that they were honoring that agreement anyway, so it's not like anything really changed for them. But in any case, Iran is not even pretending to honor this agreement anymore, and this has been confirmed by satellite images that shown just recently the reconstruction work at the Parchin military base, 50 kilometers outside of Tehran. This base was known to be the site of experiments linked to the construction of a triggered device for a nuclear weapon, and it was hit hard by Israel last October. It was not hit again during the 12-day war in June, but now it is being rebuilt, so it might need to be hit again, but that's just speculation on my part. So we'll see what happens with that. And remember that following the 12-day war, President Trump claimed that the United States had completely destroyed Iran's nuclear program and called on it to return to negotiations, but he also added a threat that if they didn't, they'd be hit again. Iran dismissed Trump's offer to return to the negotiations, and Iran's president even went so far as to call him a clown. I've commented before on the Iranian regime's very bad habit of lying to everybody, including themselves. This bad habit has already caused an enormous amount of totally unnecessary suffering for the people of Iran and millions of other people in the Middle East and all over the world. Let us hope that it ends soon. There is currently a great deal of pressure on the Ayatollah regime coming from a variety of sources, including internal unrest in Iran itself, as the country is facing severe economic, environmental, and cultural issues. Now that the nuclear agreement has formally expired, economic sanctions have been reimposed on Iran by European countries, further complicating conditions for this regime. In the near to medium-term future, something will have to change in Iran, and the regime has choices to make about whether it will continue to pursue nuclear weapons, re-enter negotiations, or go back to war. These decisions will affect everyone in this region and have far-reaching consequences all over the world. So keep spreading the truth, and most importantly, remember that this is a spiritual war. And how do we fight a spiritual war? We pray. God is listening. So let's pray for wisdom to our leaders dealing with the nuclear agreement, the threats, the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, very complicated issues. Let's pray that God will give His wisdom to our leaders. Let's pray for the IDF soldiers that are protecting us, if it's in Syria, if it's in Lebanon, Judea and Samaria, and in the Gaza Strip. Let's keep praying for our hostages to have a swift return to their loved ones, to their families in Israel. Let's keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem.
Hello, this is Mati here in Jerusalem with TBN Israel.
This is Yair Pinto from TBN Israel here in Jerusalem. TBN Israel is keeping viewers informed with Israel-focused news, culture, and what God is doing in this land.
Support TBN Israel today online at tbn.org/Israel.